It was supposed to be a weekend away from everything, a chance for four friends to escape the pressures of high school life and unwind in the secluded countryside. Jordan Davis, an 18-year-old with an easy charm, had invited his girlfriend, Vanessa Green, along with their closest friends, Lindsay Foster and Michael Hayes, to spend the weekend at his parents' vacation house in rural Idaho. The house, nestled on the edge of a sprawling forest, was the perfect getaway, peaceful, remote, and far from prying eyes. Friday night began innocently enough. The group arrived at the house in the late afternoon, the sun casting a golden hue over the quiet landscape. Jordan's parents were away on a business trip, leaving the spacious cabin like home entirely to the teens. Inside, the atmosphere was relaxed as they settled in for the evening, playing music, cooking dinner together, and sharing laughs. Vanessa and Jordan, who had been dating for just over a year, were inseparable as usual. Lindsay and Michael, more casual in their relationship, were comfortable and easygoing, enjoying each other's company without the intensity that often marked young love. By midnight, the house was quiet, the laughter and conversation fading into the stillness of the night. It was the last time anyone would see all four of them alive. The next day, the town sheriff's office received a frantic call. "Please help. Everyone is dead." The voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable through the sheer terror. The dispatcher traced the call back to Lindsay Foster's cell phone, the address Jordan's parents' vacation home. Sheriff Bob Miller and his team immediately dispatched to the scene, racing through the winding roads to the remote property. When they arrived, the sight that awaited them was unlike anything they had ever seen. The front door of the house was slightly ajar when Sheriff Miller and his deputies arrived, their flashlights cutting through the deepening twilight. There was no sign of movement from inside, no sound at all. With weapons drawn, they entered cautiously, their boots crunching on gravel before sinking into the silence of the blood-stained floorboards. The living room was in complete disarray. Furniture was overturned, and shards of broken glass littered the floor. Blood streaked the walls, a gruesome testament to the violence that had unfolded. But it wasn't until they ventured deeper into the house that they found the victims. Jordan was the first. His body lay crumpled in the hallway leading to the bedrooms, his throat viciously slashed, eyes frozen wide in shock. A pool of dark, sticky blood surrounded him, soaking into the hardwood beneath. In the adjacent room they found Vanessa. She had been stabbed multiple times, her once vibrant eyes now hollow, lifeless. Her body was positioned unnaturally, as if she had been trying to flee before succumbing to her wounds. Michael was found in the kitchen, his body sprawled near the stove. He had been bludgeoned repeatedly, the back of his skull shattered from the force of the attack. Blood dripped from the countertops, leaving a haunting scene of utter carnage. It was clear that the assault had been frenzied, brutal. Then, they found Lindsay. She was barely alive, huddled in a corner near the back door, her body limp and covered in deep cuts and bruises. Her clothes were soaked in blood, her own, as well as her friends'. She had suffered significant trauma, but somehow she had survived, barely. Sheriff Miller immediately called for paramedics, who rushed her to the local hospital's intensive care unit. Detective Michelle Harrison arrived at the scene soon after, her face grim as she surveyed the horrors before her. Known for her meticulous attention to detail, she began directing the crime scene investigation, already piecing together the fragments of what had gone so horribly wrong. "This wasn't random," she muttered to Sheriff Miller, her eyes scanning the room. "This was something personal, something savage." As Lindsay was rushed to the hospital, barely clinging to life, Michelle and Sheriff Miller were left with the most chilling question: who could have done this? The crime scene was secured, but the questions surrounding the gruesome murders seemed endless. Detective Michelle Harrison spent hours meticulously examining every inch of the house. She had seen her share of violent crimes, but there was something particularly unsettling about this one. The sheer brutality indicated intense rage. Yet there was no sign of forced entry, no shattered windows, no broken locks. Whoever had committed these murders had likely known the victims. Sheriff Bob Miller stood nearby, his face pale as he stared at the blood-stained walls. "We've got nothing so far," he muttered, frustrated. "No murder weapon, no witnesses aside from Lindsay, and she's unconscious." Michelle nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. Lindsay, the only survivor, was in critical condition, her injuries severe. The doctors had sedated her, and they couldn't predict when she'd regain consciousness, if she ever would. Without her statement, all they had were the bodies, the blood, and the unanswered questions. For now, the most pressing task was determining the timeline. Based on the state of the bodies, the medical examiner estimated that the murders had occurred late Friday night or early Saturday morning. The call for help had come in Saturday evening, meaning Lindsay had somehow survived in that house for nearly a full day, injured and terrified, before finding the strength to make that desperate call. This was someone they knew, Michelle stated confidently. There's no way they would have let a stranger inside. Plus, the attack. It's too vicious. This wasn't just about killing. It was personal. Sheriff Miller nodded, his expression grim. But who? Jordan's parents are out of town, and no one else was supposed to be here. Michelle's thoughts drifted to the fact that this was a small town. Everyone knew everyone, and the teenagers had all grown up together. If this was someone they knew, it could be someone the whole town knew. We need to talk to their family, she said, and we need to start digging into their lives. Friends, enemies, anyone who might have had a reason to do this. But as Michelle left the scene, something gnawed at her, a strange, inexplicable feeling that something was being missed, something crucial. The next day, Michelle and Sheriff Miller began their interviews, starting with the families of the victims. Jordan's parents, devastated by the news, were still away on business, too far to offer immediate insight. Vanessa's mother wept uncontrollably as she described her daughter as a sweet, innocent girl who had no enemies. Michael's parents were similarly distraught, insisting their son was quiet and kept to himself. No one had any clue why someone would want to harm them. The detectives turned their focus to the group's friendships, hoping to find a crack in the surface that could explain the violence. Jordan, Vanessa, Lindsay, and Michael were close-knit, but there were hints of tension, subtle at first, but noticeable when probed deeper. A high school friend mentioned a recent argument between Jordan and Michael, something about Jordan being too controlling over Vanessa. Apparently, Michael had stepped in, defending Vanessa when Jordan became jealous. It hadn't escalated into anything physical, but there had been an awkward distance between the boys ever since. That could be something, Michelle mused, jotting it down in her notebook. But when she spoke to Vanessa's friends, another layer of complexity unfolded. According to them, Vanessa had been confiding in Lindsay recently, sharing her concerns about Jordan. He had become possessive, overly concerned with where she was and who she was with. Vanessa was planning to break up with him after this weekend. Michelle felt the pieces starting to shift. If there was jealousy or tension in the group, it could have created the perfect storm. But jealousy alone didn't explain the level of violence they had seen. Back at the station, Sheriff Miller's team was analyzing Lindsay's phone, hoping to retrieve any text messages, calls, or data that could shed light on what had happened before that desperate call came through. But so far, the phone had offered no clues. All calls made before Saturday were routine, with nothing out of the ordinary. "We're missing something," Michelle said, pacing in front of the evidence board. This kind of rage doesn't just come out of nowhere. It wasn't until later that evening, as Michelle was reviewing the case files alone, that she received a call from the hospital. Lindsay had woken up. Though still weak, the doctors believed she was stable enough for questioning. Michelle grabbed her coat and rushed out the door. Lindsay was the key to unlocking what had happened that night, and Michelle needed to hear her side of the story before time ran out. As she drove through the empty streets, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that the truth might be darker than they had imagined. Detective Michelle Harrison arrived at the hospital, her pulse quickening as she made her way to Lindsay's room. The intensive care unit was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of machines. A nurse met her at the door, explaining that Lindsay was still weak and heavily sedated, but able to speak if approached gently. Michelle entered the dimly lit room. Lindsay lay on the bed, her face pale, bandages covering most of her arms and torso. Her eyes flickered open, glazed with pain and fear. She was barely conscious, but aware enough to recognize the detective. "Lindsay," Michelle began softly, pulling up a chair beside her. "I know you've been through something unimaginable, but we need your help. You're the only one who can tell us what happened that night." Lindsay's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but her throat was dry. A nurse handed her some water, and after a few shaky sips, she managed to whisper, "They're dead. They're all dead." Michelle nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the words. "We know, Lindsay. We found them. Jordan, Vanessa, and Michael. They were murdered. But you survived. Can you tell us what happened? Anything you remember?" Tears welled up in Lindsay's eyes as she struggled to piece together the fragments of that horrific night. She blinked slowly, trying to focus, but the memories were fragmented, like a shattered mirror. "We were having fun," she began, her voice weak. "We were drinking, laughing. Everything was fine. But then, Jordan, he got angry." Michelle leaned in closer. "Angry about what?" Lindsay paused, her brow furrowing as if searching for the right words. "He and Michael, they started arguing over Vanessa. It got bad. Jordan was yelling. He grabbed her. And then, Michael stepped in." Michelle's pulse quickened. "What happened after that?" Lindsay winced, closing her eyes as if the memory was too painful to relive. "Everything. Everything went dark. I heard screaming. So much screaming. Then blood. I don't remember how it happened. It was like, it wasn't Jordan anymore. He was different." Michelle's mind raced, trying to make sense of Lindsay's disjointed recollection. Jordan's anger seemed to have ignited the violence, but Lindsay's vague description of him being different made her uneasy. She needed more. "Lindsay, do you remember anything else? Did you see anyone else there that night? Could someone have come into the house?" Lindsay's eyes fluttered open again, and for a moment she stared blankly at the ceiling. No, no one else. Just us. Her voice cracked as she added, "Please, I'm so tired. I don't want to remember." Michelle gently squeezed Lindsay's hand. "I know. You've been through so much, but you're safe now. We'll find out who did this." Lindsay's eyes closed once more, and the nurse signaled that the questioning should end. Michelle stood up, her mind buzzing with more questions than answers. If Lindsay was telling the truth, then Jordan's anger may have spiraled into something far worse than anyone had imagined. But there was something about Lindsay's hesitation, her disjointed memory, that bothered Michelle. What had really happened in that house? And why couldn't Lindsay seem to remember it clearly? Back at the station, Michelle gathered her notes from the hospital and met with Sheriff Bob Miller, who had spent the afternoon combing through Jordan's background for any red flags. He sat behind his desk, a look of frustration on his face as he sifted through the files. "Nothing out of the ordinary with Jordan," he grumbled. "No history of violence, no criminal record. His friends said he was always a bit of a hothead, but nothing that would suggest he was capable of this." Michelle sighed, setting her notebook down. "Lindsay's story is all over the place. She said Jordan was angry, that there was an argument between him and Michael over Vanessa. But after that, things get hazy. She's either blocking something out or she genuinely doesn't remember." Sheriff Miller rubbed his chin, considering her words. If Jordan was the one who snapped, it still doesn't explain everything. He's dead too. Someone else had to be involved. Exactly, Michelle agreed. The level of violence suggests more than just a fight between friends. This was overkill, brutal and personal. Whoever did this wanted them all dead. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "And Lindsay surviving. That doesn't sit right with me. How does one person survive an attack like that?" Michelle had been thinking the same thing. Lindsay had been gravely injured, but she had made the call for help, even after hours of lying in a house filled with her friends' bodies. How had she survived? Was she simply lucky, or was there something more to it? As they sat in the small, dimly lit office, a deputy knocked on the door, interrupting their conversation. "Detective, Sheriff, we've got something. There's footage from a nearby gas station. It shows the group stopping there Friday night before heading to the house." Michelle's interest piqued. "Anything unusual?" The deputy nodded. "Yeah, there was someone else at the gas station, someone who followed them out." Michelle and Sheriff Miller exchanged glances, their suspicions growing. "Let's see that footage," Michelle said, her voice tense. She had a gut feeling that this case was about to take a much darker turn. Whoever had been at that gas station might be the key to unlocking the mystery and revealing the true monster behind the murders. Michelle Harrison and Sheriff Miller gathered around the small screen as the grainy footage from the gas station played in front of them. The timestamp read Friday night, just before 9 p.m. The camera showed the parking lot as Jordan's car pulled up to the pump. The group exited, laughing and talking, appearing relaxed as they filled the tank and grabbed snacks inside the convenience store. But then, just as the group was about to leave, something caught Michelle's eye. In the corner of the screen, a dark SUV pulled up, and a figure stepped out, lingering near the gas station's entrance. The person wore a hoodie, the hood pulled low over their face, obscuring any identifying features. Their body language was tense, almost predatory, as they watched Jordan and the others. "There," Michelle said, pointing at the screen. "That's not a coincidence." The SUV remained parked as Jordan's car pulled away, and sure enough, the shadowy figure got back into the vehicle and slowly followed them out of the lot. The footage wasn't clear enough to make out a license plate, but the fact that someone had followed the group into the dark, isolated woods was enough to send a chill down Michelle's spine. "That's our suspect," she said, her voice low and firm. "Whoever was in that SUV followed them, and my guess is they were waiting for the right moment to strike." Sheriff Miller nodded, his expression darkening. "We need to track that vehicle. Someone in town must have seen it. We'll get the word out." Michelle didn't say it, but her gut told her they were closing in. If they could find the driver of that SUV, they might uncover the motive behind the killings and how everything had spiraled so far out of control. But something still nagged at her. Lindsay had insisted there was no one else in the house, that it had just been the four of them. Had she not seen the intruder? Or had she been too traumatized to remember? Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that Lindsay wasn't telling them everything. Either she was too scared or hiding something vital to protect herself. Before leaving the station, Michelle contacted the local auto shops, trying to get a lead on the vehicle from the gas station. She also had the deputy send the footage to neighboring precincts in hopes of identifying the SUV. If this person had stalked them from the gas station to the cabin, there had to be more to uncover. The longer she stared at the footage, the more the nagging doubt in the back of her mind grew. 2 days passed without much progress, but Michelle's instincts told her they were on the verge of a breakthrough. Lindsay's memory remained spotty, but the fact that she had survived still weighed heavily on Michelle's mind. How had she been the only one to make it out alive? Was it just a stroke of luck, or was there something more sinister at play? Then, On Tuesday morning, Michelle got a call from one of the deputies. They had tracked down a local mechanic who remembered fitting the description from the gas station footage. The vehicle had come in for repairs just last week, a busted taillight. Owner's name is Craig Larkin, the deputy explained over the phone. Mid-30s, local, no criminal record, but the guy keeps to himself. Lives alone on the outskirts of town. Michelle felt a surge of adrenaline. Did you run a background check? Yeah, nothing serious, but the deputy hesitated. Larkin's got a brother who passed away a few years back, overdosed. Guess who he was dating before he died? Vanessa Green. Michelle's heart skipped a beat. Vanessa had dated Craig Larkin's brother? This was exactly the kind of personal connection she had been looking for. The pieces were starting to fit together, but she still needed more. We're heading over there now, the deputy continued. Thought you'd want to be there for the questioning. I'm on my way, Michelle said, grabbing her coat. She relayed the information to Sheriff Miller as they rushed out the door. The drive to Larkin's house felt tense, the cold autumn air whipping past the car windows. Michelle's mind raced as they neared the outskirts of town, where Craig Larkin's small, rundown house sat nestled at the edge of the woods. When they arrived, the SUV from the footage was parked in the driveway. Michelle's pulse quickened. As they knocked on the door, Michelle braced herself. If Craig Larkin was their guy, this was it, the confrontation that could finally bring the truth to light. The door opened slowly, revealing a man in his mid-30s with a gaunt face and deep-set eyes. Craig Larkin's expression was wary, as if he knew why they were there. Mr. Larkin, Sheriff Miller said, stepping forward, we'd like to ask you a few questions about last weekend. Craig's eyes flickered with recognition, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing them into his dimly lit home. The tension in the air was palpable as they took seats in his sparsely furnished living room. The walls were bare, save for a few family photos, including one of his deceased brother. You know why we're here, Michelle began, her voice steady but firm. We have footage of you following Jordan Davis and his friends last Friday night. You drove to the house where 3 of them were murdered. Craig's jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. I didn't kill anyone, he muttered, his voice hoarse. Michelle leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. Then tell us what you were doing there. Why were you following them? For a moment, Craig was silent, his gaze dropping to the floor. Michelle could see the conflict in his expression, the guilt, the anger, the grief. I just wanted to scare them, he finally whispered, because of Vanessa. My brother. He loved her. When he died, she just moved on, like he never mattered. I followed them to the house that night, but I swear, I didn't do anything. When I got there, they were already dead. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. Craig's confession was chilling, but it wasn't enough. If he hadn't killed them, then who had? And why would someone else have known to target that group? There was still something missing, something darker lurking beneath the surface. Craig Larkin's words echoed in Michelle's mind as she processed his confession. He claimed he had followed them but had found the group already dead when he arrived. It was hard to believe. His connection to Vanessa, his anger over his brother's death had all painted him as a prime suspect, but Michelle's gut told her there was more to this story than Craig was letting on. You're saying you followed them just to scare them? Sheriff Miller asked, his tone skeptical. You were angry enough to drive out there in the middle of the night, and then what? You just left. Craig's eyes darted nervously to the floor, his hands trembling. I didn't think it would go that far, he muttered. I just wanted them to know they couldn't forget him. I parked outside for a while, but then I saw blood through the window. I panicked. Michelle leaned forward, her voice steady but insistent. Craig, this doesn't add up. You saw the blood, then what? Did you go inside? Craig's breathing quickened. I didn't want to go in, but I heard something. It sounded like someone was still alive. I went to the back door, and that's when I saw her, Lindsay. She was covered in blood, crawling toward me. She looked like she was going to die. Michelle exchanged a glance with Sheriff Miller. Craig's account placed him at the scene of the crime after the murders, but his story still felt incomplete. If he hadn't killed anyone, who had? Why didn't you call the police? Michelle asked, her eyes narrowing. Craig shook his head, his voice breaking. I was scared. I thought no one would believe me. I didn't touch her. I just ran. I didn't want to be the one caught there. It looked bad. Michelle stood, pacing the small living room. Craig's story, while chaotic, had the ring of truth at least partially, but something was still missing. He wasn't telling the whole story, or maybe there was another layer they hadn't uncovered yet. Craig, we're going to need to bring you in for further questioning, Sheriff Miller said, his voice firm. You're not under arrest, but we need to clarify some things. Craig didn't resist. He simply nodded, looking defeated. As they led him out of the house, Michelle's mind raced. Craig was part of this puzzle, but he wasn't the mastermind. He had stumbled into a scene far more horrifying than he expected, but someone else had orchestrated the brutal murders. The focus shifted back to Lindsay. The image of her crawling toward Craig, gravely injured, lingered in Michelle's thoughts. Lindsay had survived a massacre, but she had also lied. She hadn't mentioned Craig's presence, or any intruder for that matter. Was it trauma clouding her memory, or was she deliberately hiding something? Back at the hospital, Michelle returned to Lindsay's room. The hospital was quiet, the sterile smell of antiseptic hanging in the air as she approached the door. Inside, Lindsay was awake, though still weak, her body healing slowly from the vicious attack. Her eyes flickered up when Michelle entered, but there was no relief in them, only fear. "Lindsay," Michelle began gently, sitting beside her bed, "I need you to be completely honest with me. I spoke to Craig Larkin." Lindsay's face tightened, her eyes widening. "Craig," her voice was barely a whisper, filled with confusion and alarm. "What does he have to do with this?" "He was at the house that night," Michelle continued. "He followed you all there. He told us he saw you covered in blood trying to escape." Lindsay's expression shifted from confusion to panic. She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. He was there. I didn't see him." Michelle studied her closely, sensing Lindsay was on the verge of breaking. "Lindsay, there's something you're not telling us. I know you've been through hell, but the only way we can find out who did this is if you tell the whole truth. Did you see Craig? Or anyone else that night?" Tears welled in Lindsay's eyes, her breathing shallow as she stared at Michelle. For a moment there was only silence, the air thick with tension. Then, finally, she spoke. "I didn't see Craig, but I knew he was following us," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Vanessa told me about him, about his brother. She thought he might still be angry with her, but I didn't think he would actually do something. I didn't think he would kill them." Michelle leaned in, her heart pounding. "So you knew he was a threat?" Lindsay shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No, it wasn't Craig, it was Jordan. He lost it. That night, after the argument with Michael, he just snapped. He grabbed a knife and it all happened so fast." Michelle's breath caught. "Jordan. You're saying Jordan was the one who attacked them?" Lindsay nodded, her face pale and haunted. "Michael tried to stop him." Vanessa screamed. "It was chaos. I tried to get away, but Jordan, he came after me. He stabbed me too. I thought I was going to die. That's when Craig showed up. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, everyone was already gone." The room seemed to close in around Michelle as she absorbed Lindsay's confession. The pieces were finally falling into place. Jordan, pushed by jealousy and anger, had snapped, turning on his friends in a violent rage. Craig had stumbled upon the scene, but Lindsay had survived the unimaginable. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" Michelle asked softly. Lindsay sobbed quietly, her voice barely audible. "I was scared. I didn't want people to hate Jordan. I loved him once. And I didn't want to be the girl who survived because her boyfriend killed her friends." Michelle sat back, her mind racing. The truth was darker than she had anticipated, but at least now, she understood the full scope of what had happened in that house. The nightmare had started with Jordan, but in the end, it was the lies and fear that had almost kept the truth buried. As Michelle left the hospital, she knew this was a case she would never forget. 3 lives had been lost in a senseless act of violence, but now, finally, the truth was out. The horror of that night had been revealed, but for Lindsay, the scars would last forever. With Lindsay's confession, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Detective Michelle Harrison felt a heavy sense of resolution, but it wasn't a clean victory. 3 young lives had been brutally ended in a whirlwind of rage, and the sole survivor, Lindsay, would carry the weight of that night forever. Jordan Davis, the seemingly charming and easygoing boyfriend, had harbored a darkness that no one had anticipated. His jealousy and possessiveness over Vanessa had been festering for months, exacerbated by her plans to break up with him. The argument with Michael had been the spark, and in a blind fury, Jordan had lashed out, killing his closest friends in a tragic, senseless act of violence. Craig Larkin, though initially a suspect, was cleared of any wrongdoing. He had followed them that night out of unresolved anger over his brother's death, but when he arrived, the carnage had already occurred. He had panicked, leaving Lindsay behind in her desperate state. While his actions were morally questionable, they weren't criminal. He was released from custody, his own grief and guilt now amplified by what he had witnessed. Michelle returned to the sheriff's office, where she and Sheriff Miller sat down to finalize the case report. The official conclusion was clear: Jordan Davis had been the sole perpetrator of the killings. The investigation was over, but the emotional toll was only beginning for the families involved. "I just don't get it," Sheriff Miller muttered, shaking his head as he stared at the report. "These were just kids. How does it get to this point?" Michelle exhaled deeply. It was jealousy, rage, whatever else was building up inside Jordan. "We'll never fully know, but sometimes people snap, and when they do, they destroy everything around them." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on the senselessness of the crime. No one had seen it coming, not Vanessa, not Michael, not even Lindsay. Jordan's final act of violence had blindsided them all. Lindsay will need help, Michelle added softly. Surviving something like that, it's not just physical. She's going to have to live with this for the rest of her life. Sheriff Miller nodded. I'll make sure we get her connected with a good counselor. Poor kid's been through enough. A week after Lindsay's final confession, Michelle visited her one last time at the hospital. Lindsay was healing, both physically and mentally, though her road to recovery would be long. The bandages were still visible, but the deep emotional scars were harder to see. When Michelle entered the room, Lindsay managed a small, fragile smile. You came back. Michelle nodded and sat beside her, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken words. I wanted to check on you, see how you're doing. Lindsay stared at the wall, her voice distant. I don't know if I'll ever really be okay. I keep seeing them, Vanessa, Michael, even Jordan. Before everything went wrong, it's like I'm stuck in that moment, over and over. Michelle placed a comforting hand on Lindsay's. You survived for a reason, Lindsay. What happened wasn't your fault. It's going to be hard, but you'll get through it. You're stronger than you think. Lindsay wiped away a tear, her voice shaking. I just wish I had done something. Maybe I could have stopped him. Michelle shook her head gently. You did what you could. Sometimes there's nothing anyone can do to prevent something like this. Jordan was already gone by the time you realized what was happening. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything they had both endured pressing down on them. For Michelle, the case was closed, but for Lindsay it was a lifelong burden.